Hi, this is David Gornoski, host of A Neighbor's Choice and Things Hidden podcast, as well as some of our other programs like Science and You with our chief science advisor, Dr. Yu, and our seed oil survival series that we continue to have great fun unpacking the truth of nutrition. I wanted to give you a quick little message saying we appreciate all the support that we get from our uh, monthly contributors and our one-time donation supporters. And we'd encourage all of you to go to our website, a neighborschoice.com, click on contribute, and make a monthly pledge today, whether it's $1, $5, 15, 20, 50, whatever you want to do. Doesn't matter. Just be a part of building this new media project that we've developed to empower and inform, to inspire, to kickstart a scientific renaissance, an anthropological breakthrough and reformation in the church. All these things are possible with your support right now. So make that commitment today and help us keep doing the productions that we have. Thank you. Today we have another discussion on things hidden. I'm joined by Shane Kennedy. How you doing, Shane?
Doing great. What about you, David?
Doing good. And I'm your host, David Gornoski. We're just going to get started with looking at current events with a big picture historical anthropological framework in mind. And so when I look at what's going on, people are always, I've said this recently on Twitter, and I'm going to keep working on this concept for a little while more, which is that in our times, it will be harder for people to have faith in the future than it will be for them to have faith in an afterlife. It seems like materialism is being defeated, at least intellectually, culturally. It's starting to lose its power over the culture. But at the same time, materialism was also wedded to a kind of hopeful, optimistic orientation towards the world. We could have atheist materialism allow us to alleviate all of our suffering through engineering marvels and so forth. We could take deserts and turn them into tropical paradises and so forth. So there's this interesting moment we're in where it's good that we're recovering the idea that there is a soul and there is something after this earth, that there's a purpose to this life and there's something after this time that we're in. But it's interesting also to think that at the same time that belief is being retrieved, we may be losing more than ever hope in the future of Earth being a positive thing. Do you see that as well?
Yes. Yeah, we're going through a shift right now. It seems, right?
Yeah. And why is
Yeah.
afterlife being retrieved, but future on Earth is being harder to believe in terms of a positive thing, you know, for the average person? Now, the elite, the globalists or whatever, if you believe what they're saying, if they believe that they believe what they're saying, they're still optimistic about the future. They want to create an, Edenic like, paradise where there's hardly any humans left and everybody's happy, right? So they want to do a mass sacrifice apparently to try to get their form of Eden back. Everybody's going to eat the beloved roach milk that you talk about a lot, and that's the lucky ones.
Yeah.
But how do you see this playing out? Why is that afterlife belief is being retrieved, but hope in a future on Earth, at least in our culture, seems to be dwindling right now?
Well, I think people have lost a sense of the future. You know, I guess maybe prior to World War I, or probably, I guess maybe you could go back even earlier than that. People had a really solid, a more solid view of themselves, at least like in the Christian world. They had a much more solid view of their place in history, of what their past was, and what they ought to do in the present, and then what their future would hold. Yeah, or kind of what they were working toward. Um, then that got, I would say that, like, in the process of World War I and World War II, that whole order got reset. And it got changed to this materialism that you were just talking about, this whole notion through engineering and through us, just through you going and getting some degree or something, that somehow that would make everything all okay. That would be your highest calling, like that would be the summit of your life. But now that whole renegotiated reset order that was established, what, about 100 years ago, roughly, or at least, or the beginning of it was, uh I guess the beginning parts of it were put in place about 100 years ago, and then kind of like finalized about 80 years ago at the end of World War II. It's all falling apart now, and people don't really have a clear view of their place in history any longer, that's just as much where they come from as where they're going,
Now,
right?
from the woke perspective in the new globalist victimist culture, they are obsessed with guilt from the past, shames and sins being and having it exposed, right? Which is a
Yeah.
thoroughly Christian on a high level sense. It's a very thoroughly Christian move to make, because
Yeah.
Christianity is the one that is the apocalypse, the unveiling of the hidden victims of every culture it engages, right? It
Mhm.
undermines hierarchies that are established based on hidden victimage, hidden sacrificial violence. That's the whole point of the entire thrust of the biblical anthology, is this kind of unveiling. I mean, even back to, when you get into the Old Testament, they're always challenging the sacrificial violence of the temples, and always exposing the voice of the underdog, the voice of the victim, the voice of Joseph thrown down in the well. The camera stays with that perspective, and yet, so when you see wokeism today obsessing over every kind of, you know, mythic story of history being reevaluated through the lens of the victim, that's a thoroughly Christian move on one level, right?
Mhm.
And the conservative to react to that and say, stop, 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 that's not appropriate. You're undermining and subverting our structures of goodness. It's not really the move to make. We almost have to outflank the left's critique of an exposure of hidden victims and outflank them in that, but yet direct it back to a kind of peace and mercy and reconciliation, right?
Yeah. Well, as far as the entire woke movement goes, uh I guess the question would be, how long do you think how long do you think that can last? The entire woke movement.
I don't know what that thing is other than, like, you could say that version of, let's say the substrate is victim concern, right? And the way you do victim concern can be in a godly way or in an ungodly way that's rivalrous towards God's kingdom of healing, right? And so the point is that human history is on a path of victim concern. Human history is on a path, as Revelation says, to understand the knowledge of the Lord. The knowledge of the Lord is the slain lamb from the foundations of the world. And the whole point of it is that the more that saturates human species, the more they have the opportunity to find another way to get along other than the threat of collective violence as the means to keep them united in opposition to those who have violated those taboos. So when we look at victimism, victim concern, let's say victim concern is more of a neutral state. Victimism is where you're trying to use the concern for victims to gain power. One does not necessarily have to be that, but that's the temptation that humans are always going to have in light of the gospel. But the idea of wokeism as it is not inevitable to be here for a long time. We could, because we have free agency, be able to decide to move away from that and go to more healthy forms of victim reevaluation in our history, in our society, in our current events. Whether we're doing that or not, we're not looking so good right now, but these things can change very quickly, I believe. It doesn't have to. I do believe that we must assume a long haul process, but one shouldn't be, in my opinion, wedded to the notion that it's going to be a long slog before we can kind of get past some of these errors that we're making as a nation, you know. But I guess just to reiterate, wokeism is just the latest mutation of a type of concern for victims, which is using it for power. It may not last. We may get a more vicious form of victimism, you know. We may get a victimism that thinks murder is good and literally supports it in raving revenge mobs. That could return. You know, where we're going to start really deconstructing thou shalt nots, you know, really, you know, because still society still largely believes that things like adultery are wrong. You've always got some of the deconstruction folks who are trying to, no, that's all just, you know, programming from oppressive, you know, institutions. But it's still largely accepted as, you know, not to be glorified, cheating and all that kind of thing. You could get to a point where victimism really takes over that, thou shalt not, and really deconstructs that very viciously and aggressively as the dominant culture, which is already kind of happening. I know, I get it, but it's still not fully happening. So there's a lot of taboo deconstructions that are left to be done, really. Although it feels like we're at the bottom of the barrel here in terms of muck to deconstruct, you know. And let me step back for a second just to say there's two types of deconstruction going on. There's deconstruction of taboos of behavior and moral conduct, and then there's deconstruction of narratives that society believes doesn't give a voice to the victims of those narratives. Does that make sense? There's kind of two things there, and they kind of go hand in hand, but they don't have to.
So why now? All right. So why do you think it is that these people that are obsessed with deconstructing everything, they seem to do it in the name of they seem to do it in the name of liberating the oppressor, right?
The oppressed. Yeah.
But how do they justify to themselves, because what they end up doing is, you know, they go and overturn the authority of every other institution but themselves or their own, and then they end up becoming authoritarians. How do they justify that to themselves and to others, or do they, or you know, or do they eventually come to a point where they or their movement, where they end up deconstructing themselves?
Yeah, eventually they will.
And then they end up giving birth to some other movement.
Yeah. And then you get to the point where you're going to have ever never ending schisms, akin to the critique made against Protestantism that there's 400,000 denominations. There will be 500,000 versions of victimism and political correctness and wokeism fighting each other, you know, but they don't have any mercy or grace, or, you know, they don't have in their worldview, the way they do their framework, they don't really have any place for, you know, at least denominations can bring grace and mercy to kind of stop the madness of rivalry, right? But which you don't, because they're still ostensibly pointed to the imitation of Christ, however meager we do it, actually. But when you have a movement that's trying to supplant Christ's gracious reconciliation of lion and lamb with a kind of lamb with a machine gun mowing down all the lions, that's what we've got with wokeism. You know, it's a kind of lambs, the revenge of the lambs. They've got machine guns and they're just, you know, tearing up the lions left and right. That's kind of the vision of what we see animating that movement. It doesn't have to stay that way, though. You know, there is
so it kind of seems like these movements that are obsessed with deconstruction, that are obsessed with overturning the existing order, overturning taboos, slaying sacred cows and everything. It seems like they have a trajectory where at the very beginning, everything seems very bright and sunny, like you know, there's a lot of hope in it, you know, that in you know, and they might even be on the right side of history in certain cases. Like they may come to the forefront of opposing racism, for, you know, for instance, and then that may be a good taboo that they slay. But then they move on and they say, all right, the next thing we're doing is we're taking on the nuclear family. and then they start taking on more and more and more stuff. So it seems like there's a trajectory where at the beginning things are bright and sunny, and it's really hard to tell. Maybe they're you might look at them and say, okay, well, they're doing some good things, but they're also doing some bad things. Let's stand with them on the good things, and then as they continue to move along in there, and they're slaying more and more and more sacred cows from their point of view, and they're overturning more and more and more norms, they eventually end up running out of stuff to do, and they end up running out of competing institutions, right? Because they end up overturning the authority of other institutions, and in doing that they end up accumulating a bunch of power themselves, right? And then they end up becoming authoritarian, and then at the peak, at the peak of their kind of like social or cultural or political dictatorship, they end up kind of collapsing under their own weight, right? Typically. So before they end up collapsing, before the deconstruction obsessed deconstructionists end up deconstructing themselves, what does that look like? What are the attributes that people can look for? Like, let's say let's say that I'm somebody. I don't really pay attention a whole lot to what's going on in the news, right? I'm just, I'm busy. I'm just living my life and everything. What are some things that the average person can look for, um, from the institutions? What does it look like when you're in those final steps, when things transition from from the society being functional to becoming an authoritarian system, where you have this victim obsessed false messianic movement that ends up taking control of everything, right before they end up achieving kind of absolute power, and then their own demise, which leads to the demise of the system overall. What does it look like? Would there be any concrete things that we could
You talk about what
establish?
does authoritarian society look like when it's starting to become authoritarian?
Yeah, well,
Well, I
I
mean, you got the
guess.
classic things that people are pointing out, like, pushing obvious lies and making everybody go along with agreeing with it to keep their jobs and everything.
Yeah.
I mean, those are classic kind of authoritarian uh, clues, but uh,
Because I guess it kind of seems to me that that they end up eventually they end up running out of um oppressors to slay. Yeah, you saw that with you saw that in Russia during the Soviet Union. Really, the history of the Soviet Union, we tend to look at it from a Western point of view as just being one big monolith from like 1923, with the official establishment of the USSR, with Western assistance, by the way. We tend to view it as being one continuous thing up until like what, 1990 or 91. That's not the case. I mean, the post Stalin Soviet history is really different from pre Stalin, from like pre death of Stalin Soviet history. And that whole kind of Leninist movement, where they were really going through society and really purging the Orthodox Church, purging capitalists, purging anybody that they could construe as being an oppressor. They eventually ran out of people to crush and slay. Stalin intervened and said, "Up, we got to put the brakes on here because the system's falling apart." And Stalin and the Orthodox Church continued to be persecuted throughout the history of the Soviet Union, and it was infiltrated, and there were all kinds of horrendous things that were done to the Orthodox Church during the Soviet Union. But there's a big difference between the purging and persecution of the Orthodox Church prior to like the early to mid 40s, to after. Stalin intervened and said we can't continue persecuting them at the rate that we're persecuting them, because now we're becoming the oppressor and we may get overthrown.
yeah.
And we need the church, in a sense.
Yeah.
especially they had to win a war, right?
Yeah.
And you
Yeah.
can't win a war when you're crushing the church, which is the vestige of hope. So I guess, what do things start to look like as that authoritarian system, as they run out of oppressors to slay, and they're transitioning to that brief authoritarian moment, you
Well,
know?
then when you lose, that goes back to the scapegoat. When the scapegoat is not sufficiently sacrificed, you go into undifferentiated chaos, which means you'll get more and more undifferentiation, more and more
Mm,
confusion as to the difference between adult and child, which is happening now. Where children should be exposed to all this, uh, you know, dark, and what is it called? The positivity, yeah, body positivity and all this
yeah.
stuff, which is meant to introduce sexual education to children at a young age. They're confused, right? There's no boundaries anymore about what is an adult versus a child. Those are being loosened. uh you know Violent, I'm telling you, things like violence are becoming, look at people always being prosecuted in these cities for defending themselves from an attacker, right? If it's a person of a minority status who's attacking them, they're in better shape to attack them than the person is to defend themselves, right? uh
Mm-hmm.
so the law becomes chaotic, undifferentiated. What we have with going on right now, trusted institutions, the groups that are supposed to be going after the mafia, FBI, look more and more, DOJ look more and more like brazen mafia. Everything's just kind of undifferentiated, right? The law looks corrupt, as more corrupt than the people in prison. The people are doing
Mm,
drugs where they don't even know what the basis of reality is. Jobs, no one wants to show up for work. In order to have success, you have to claim to be a victim and play politics rather than to, pursue achievement and merit. I mean, that's the breakdown of every kind of norm in society, really. Um, uh, and I don't think that's healthy for anybody to have that continue. But I see the concern for victims is like a sub. This is not an approach. This is not an effective word, but I used it earlier, so that's what I'll use now. It's like a substrate. You're going to continually have victim concern awareness, which is going to create all kinds of opportunities, good and bad. So when you talk about like this inevitable revolutionary swing, it's not the only story going on there. It's just like a parasitical dark impulse of human behavior on top of the substrate of victim awareness continuing. Does that make sense? Like,
yeah.
as media technology develops, the Christian gospel revelation permeates those newer forms of media technology and illuminates kind of a different awareness of the ways in which we have had blind spots as society. And so that's a good thing. That's an inevitably good movement that kind of happens and fits and starts in history to societies that are permeated with the gospel. Now you talk about these revolutionary movements that start off hopeful and they go crazy and all that. Go look at the foundation. We've had this kind of romance with psychology and therapeutic industry, which I really liked that article by Matthew Crawford in unheard.com called "It Was the Sexual Revolution a Government Psyop?" Right? Because he
Oh
goes
yeah.
into the origins of a lot of the psychologists that became the new basis that the State Department and other government agencies were actively subsidizing and foisting into the public on every square. I mean, on every corner of every Main Street USA. Psychology and therapy being the new means of dealing with your problems, right? Instead of the church, right? And these were folks who had a particular ideology that said that the church, well, first of all, they were concerned, the psychologists were concerned, or the government was concerned, that folks who were doing these horrible bombing campaigns in World War II were being too affected by the carnage they were inflicting to continue effectively. And they wanted to figure out how
Yeah.
to condition soldiers to be more effective at not having burnout, to go mass slaughter people. That's the birthplace. So let's start there. That's the birthplace of what we have modern therapy today. That doesn't mean everybody who's in the field is all bad, but that's the birthplace.
Right.
The birthplace was, how do we get bombers to murder people more efficiently without having any moral exhaustion? Whoa, talk about sacrificial origins of this industry that has supplanted God's church as the foundation for relationship healing. My goodness.
Yeah.
But see, people, when you don't know these origins, you just think that the world was always this way, where, uh, therapeutic psychology and counseling and so forth was the foundation of like how to deal with relationships, and then religion's like this little superfluous, little backwards thing that's kind of a barnacle to our life.
Hmm.
That is kind of a side thing. No, it was engineered by our government this way, that the therapeutic culture and industry would become to dominate, right? The discourse about things like sexuality and family formation. You talk about the nuclear family or the extended family, which was deconstructed before the nuclear family. All these things were under attack by psychologists who had an axe to grind against normalcy and decency and boundaries and differentiation. I looked at some of the histories of some of these people. We'll have to do a deep dive into this some of the time, about some of the psychologists that the founding
Yeah.
of this therapy movement that the United States government actively foisted onto its people, because they were concerned. The psychologists that the United States government brought in, were concerned that if the same impulse that made the bombers reticent to continue bombing these countries into oblivion was coded by their Christian moral framework, and that it was suppressing their. And if you could deconstruct desire and deconstruct the father and deconstruct sexual boundaries, you could liberate their mind, and then they wouldn't have this repression thing that's holding them back from being compliant little killers. So the entire formula. What have we got since that? A century of lies and wars and murders and incarceration beyond belief, right? And broken
Yeah.
families. The government paid for it. The government pushed it onto its people, because the victim narrative that allowed them to do that is, they said, well, if they allow these middle American values of family and mom and pop and all that to continue, they'll turn into Nazis, just like the ones in Germany. We can't have that. So let's go ahead and pre-psyop these people. And that's where we get the sexual revolution and all that stuff. But also, really, everything kind of starts in terms of this epoch, really starts taking off around the World War II era,
Yeah.
in terms of therapy culture. And therapy culture is the basis by which we have wokeism, right? In some ways, right? Which where you can kind of, where your mind, can liberate yourself from the shackles of boundaries and, differentiation from gender, differentiation from whatever desires you want to, pursue. All that is where wokeism is driving most of its animation right now.
Yeah. Yeah. It seems like we have a lot of people that are going to. It seems like there's a lot of confusion as to what therapy is supposed to be. Is supposed to be. Therapy is supposed to be there to help clarify, to help make reality more clear. To try to help you see where you are more clearly. And then for you to to pursue a more ordered way of living, based upon a more a clearer grasp of what your reality is. But unfortunately, I think a lot of people are going to therapy to seek absolution. They're going to therapy to seek forgiveness. And also too, to seek affirmation now too. And it's really, really bad. And I guess that kind of brings me to ask the question: does the morality of at least every modern authoritarian, can you summarize the morality of every authoritarian in one word, in consent? Because I don't know, it sort of seems like, is there a relationship between the undifferentiated society that's the result of overturning all the taboos and norms? Is there a relationship between the indifferentiation and the push toward making consent the highest moral question?
What do you mean by that? That the consent is the last stop gap between
Yeah,
undifferentiation.
yeah, that if you're talking about like the body positivity stuff, and you were mentioning eliminating the the defined roles of like parents and children and everything, you know, what they're replacing those defined roles and taboos and norms with is they're just saying consent. They're just saying they're just saying, well, you are an autonomous individual,
Yeah.
and if you consent to something, then that's morally good.
Yeah.
Now, if you're coerced to consent to something like a medical procedure
Yeah.
or something like that, then that's okay as long that then that's morally okay as long as you consented to it. So I don't know.
If the
It
collective,
seemed
they believe that you don't have to have consent if the collective believes that the disease is going to get you or something. They can force you to take it. A lot of those folks, they're really big
well,
on consent when it comes to sexual deviancy, but not much else. Think about it. Really,
yeah.
what else are they? What are they big on consent about?
Well, what they'll
How about your
force you to do
property?
is
Can you have your property? If can you? Do you have to have consent to have your property taken from them by them? No. I'm saying the Borg
well,
of the leftist, framework of this. They really don't. First Amendment.
but but think about the whole concept of the social contract that they
Yeah.
always that they teach kids in middle school. What they say is that you consented to your government when you were born.
Well, they're going to get rid of that now. They're going to get rid of it and make it more of a conspiracy theory that social contract was always like a white supremacist plot to subdue and torture everybody else. That's going to be the new thing. And it's already the thing. It'll trickle out into the mainstream
well
discourse.
well well I guess the thing, the only pushback I would have to that is that the whole notion that you grant consent to the state just because you're born, you grant them consent to rule your life. That seems to be the end goal of all of these people that are fixated on deconstructing all institutions. And it's funny that the only institution that they don't want to deconstruct is the state.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
they want to deconstruct the church. They want to deconstruct the family, and then what they want to do is create this. They want to extend the state and create like a Frankenstein replacement for each one of those institutions.
Now Antifa though,
And it seems like the heart of it is the social contract.
Antifa, though, ostensibly says that they're anti-state, right? They want to abolish prisons, which would be kind of the teeth of the state, right? That's what they say.
Well,
I'm saying some of the
it kind
people
of
in those protests
well, it
think
kind
that
of
they're doing anarcho-communism. They're accelerating the anarcho-communism coming into fruition.
it kind of seems like what they're wanting to do is eliminate the only role that like that the really the only role that the Apostle Paul defines as in Romans 13. The Apostle Paul says that the government is there to be do you remember the exact verbiage? To be a terror to evildoers
Yeah,
or something.
use the sword for punishing evil and so forth.
Yeah, it says to submit to your governing authorities, which I mean, governing authorities is not defined there. Yeah, so it's kind of open, but the whole notion that the role of the governing authorities you're supposed to submit to is that they're supposed to be a terror to evildoers, and that they're supposed to be there for to maintain order in society, to punish criminals. That seems to be like when you're talking about Antifa, that's the one role that they don't want government to have.
Yeah. Yeah.
They want for it to be a free for all with that, but then they want for the government to replace father. They want for it to replace mother. They want for the government to replace grandmother, grandfather. They want for it to replace all those
But
roles.
they don't see it as the government, really. They see it as like the government is just the manifestation of the violent will of the people, which is just and whole. And you said and you asked, I think, earlier about why is it that they don't see what they're doing as wrong or something, I think. But it's because, again, they're parasitically animated they're parasitically trying to leech off. But what they don't realize is that the stone the builders rejected will defeat them by their attempts to leech off of it. But like there's a power in being a victim in a Christ haunted society, because it puts you in proximation with Jesus on the cross. You know, the one who is innocent and accused and left to die alone. That is the image that has inverted and upended the pagan empires around the world, and it's conquering the whole world as we speak. And it will conquer the world through. So what wokeism will do is wokeism will try to like grab that energy it unconsciously feels of the victim power and then use it for its own purposes. But in so using it for its own purposes, it will subvert itself, and the gospel will spread through that. The gospel spreads, because think about like even like something as crass as like material globalism, you know, it's still, you know, even with all the things that, you know, the conservatives want to critique about it, you know, that it, you know, it's speaking this idolatry and this error and this thing, all those errors have bits and pieces of the gospel still attached to them, right? And so when you're introducing the era of globalism to China or other countries, it's still coming in with the gospel technology coming in and affecting its culture for the God too. You see what I mean? That's what the Bible talks about, this yeast working itself through a loaf. So it kind of has this the woke people and globalist people, they're trying to subvert this gospel energy that they feel in the culture intuitively. But the gospel will subvert their subversion, because it will spread its values and deconstruct the hive mind needed to maintain their authoritarian designs. It will deconstruct it and make it ineffective. And the one thing they don't want to deconstruct, the thing that makes the leftist project very hard to crack, is they don't want to deconstruct the self. They're still caught up in that Rousseauian nightmare where they think it's all just institutions that are screwing up humans, and humans are just idyllic, perfect in and of themselves, right? They don't have any conception of the fall. They don't have any like real conception of like depravity at the core of human condition, right? And the idea of like the impulse to scapegoat is not inherent to one race or gender. They just look at power differentials as they see them in recent history, and they say, whoever has been the beneficiary in their very black and white cartoonish view of the power differentials is inherently deserving of punishments and revenge power differentials foisted onto them as a means of like, you know, punishing them and sacrificing them for having benefited from the lack of power of others around them. That's kind of their whole game, right? That's what equity is all about.
Yeah.
You know, but the way you beat it, the only way, to me, the way you beat it is that you have to show the public, the people in the middle, the people who go out to see the lectures of Jesus, but they won't necessarily stay for the hard parables sometimes. The people in the middle, they'll go one way or the other, and they'll go based on who's performing signs and wonders. And Jesus told us to perform signs and wonders. And when you perform signs and wonders, that's how you are allowed to have the authority for the people in the middle to say, you know what, maybe this way is a better way. Maybe I can follow this way, right? And maybe there is hope for the future. Maybe the future doesn't reside in punishing my never-ending group of rivals that bothered me. Because ultimately, what the Antichrist has going for it is a desire to channel resentments, because the Antichrist is the lawless one. He's dissolving boundaries, but as you dissolve boundaries, it opens up more and more resentments. And so that's what the Antichrist promise of the woke project and everything that comes after it is promising, to resolve those resentments through a mighty act of just violence. And so Christians come along, and we have to be the peacemakers and compete with that impetus to deify resentment and envy with self-emptying acts of grace and mercy, right? And creative dynamism that helps solve problems for the people at a more satisfying rate than what envy and resentment promises to do for them. Envy and resentment promises to solve problems, but it never does. But it feels good to nurse it, and it feels good in the moment to see people who you envy and resent have pain. That's a state of hell that they're in, right? That's hell on earth. And so you have to solve that ultimately through self-giving, through self-emptying, there was something, that's what the cross was all about. Those people were so jealous of Jesus, They were resentful and they were jealous and they were envious. They wished they could have been him. But he didn't say, on the cross, you wait till I get off this cross one day. I'm going to smite you guys. I'm going to tear you up so bad. You're going to get your tail. Come on, hit me again. I'm going to get you back. Wait till I get off this cross in a few thousand years or whatever, when you're dead, in hell or whatever. He didn't say it like that, right? He wasn't going for that. I'm going to get you back. I'm going to get you back. That's the spirit that animates the left and the right too, really, because the right's just imitating the left. They're just a slower version of the revolutionary spirit most of the time. But they're trying to, the right is trying to go back to the garden, right? But you can't go back to the garden. You have to go to the city, because that's where Revelation ends, with the city. Mm-hmm. So the thing is, and I read a good article by a person, I think Kristen de Montfort, on Substack, that we'll talk about maybe in a future episode. But she makes some good points about how Yahweh, when King David is ascending to the throne in Jerusalem, and he takes this pagan town, Jerusalem, and he turns it into this place where he's going to make it the capital of his project. And he invites Yahweh to be there. Yahweh's a little shy. He doesn't want to be in the city, right? Because he doesn't want to be contained by what city life comes with, which is this sacrificial, might makes right grandeur orientation that is kind of in opposition to what Jesus has come to set forth in history. But eventually, we have to be able to make peace with the city and not flee it. The conservative impulse is to flee to the hills permanently, and to have sheep and, and just hide, right? Or and just participate in the culture, but not too much, that kind of thing. But we can't just do that. We have to be able to meet the culture's pain where it's at, and to provide better solutions than the resentments and envies that they're nurturing in that culture. That's ultimately what they're doing. You watch the Barbie movie, and people are saying people are breaking up their relationships after they watch Barbie and stuff. It's all sowing resentments and envies and bitterness.
So what would you say about the in the kind of, I guess you would call it like the new right or something? There's this big movement for parallel economies. They say, well, if PayPal is going to cancel people, some people on the right, and have grand designs to cancel most everybody on the right, then the right needs to create their own PayPal. They just need to create their own, and just allow the left to use PayPal, and then allow the right to use the right-wing version of PayPal. Do you think that will work?
No, big.
The whole parallel institutions thing.
That's their mimetic rivalry and desiring to be like the left, just going down the next step. Because it was right-wing people who created PayPal. Elon Musk and Peter Thiel are both pretty conservative. You can call them libertarian, whatever, but they're pretty rather conservative compared to the folks on the left today. And they created PayPal. But eventually, when these institutions get so big, they get sold and everything gets corrupted, because top-down economies are going to naturally corrupt the, companies that are created into the Borg of what the government and its, university allies are going to sell as the religion, right? So they're going to get swept up in the religion if they want to have their power.
So would you say that that's them trying to run to the hills, the whole parallel economy thing?
In some ways it is like, like a cheap rip-off, smaller version of everything that the Hollywood does. Yeah. I mean, that, for sure. But I mean, I understand the impulse to it, and it's not to be disdained completely, because I mean, there is this thought that, hey, if I could have a phone service that doesn't donate to hell on earth, okay, sounds good. So there's nothing wrong inherently with it in and of itself. But when that's your biggest thing you have going, is just let's copy what they do and do a small little, ghettoized version for our people only, like Truth Social, it's so dominated by Trump and his movement that where will it
Yeah.
be when he's gone? I mean, it could evolve into something, I guess, but it looks like it's just going to be a smaller little, ghettoized version of what Twitter is, which is, it serves his purposes. He doesn't want to have to be beholden to whoever's running Twitter, but you have to go bigger than that. That's the point. We have, and we have to go bigger than that. We have to figure out what are the touch points that the average normie fundamentally feels the state and its corporate allies have sovereignty over their life over. And it's usually the basics: healthcare, food on the
Yeah.
table that's healthy and nutritious, not poisoned, energy to get in their car and afford it. So those basic
Yeah.
those kitchen table issues, and then the resentments and all that stuff are all hovering around it. But those kitchen table conversation issues, the kitchen table bread and butter topics, really is where we need to do all of our imaginative, work. That's where we need to really be our creative best at. Like, why do you think this UFO thing's going on? This idea of like these grand technologies that somebody else has. Well, why don't we create technologies that are better than the UFOs?
Yeah.
We can't. We don't know how. Well, they did. Somebody did that's flying that thing around. Somebody's flying that little thing around. Whoever it is, they figured it out. Doesn't that inspire? Why don't we imitate that if we want a parallel economy and stop hiding it? Why don't we do it live on YouTube as in our shop, trying to figure out how to make one of those Tic Tacs fly like that, up to the sky, up to the water, like all over the place, up into outer space. But all we do is we talk about how to like imitate, Twitter. Who cares about Twitter? I mean, Twitter has
Yeah.
its role, but I mean, again, if all you can do is say, hey, let's create a new environment where we can have lunchroom drama, that's not a leadership quality. We don't need more lunchroom drama forums. We've got plenty of that on the internet. We need people who are so busy and so fascinated with the wonders of God's creation that they're just obsessed with doing something beautiful for their fellow human being, with engineering and technology.
How do you deal with the existing institutions though? Like PayPal, or let's say the universities. Yeah, how should your average Christian deal with those institutions? So should a Christian say, "Well, I'm not going to patron the university because it's a left-wing cesspool," but the fewer of them that get involved in that left-wing cesspool, the more of a cesspool it's going to become. So basically, do we just say to hell with it and we create we create new parallel ones, or do we say we're going to enter it as agents of change? The way that the leftists did to those institutions like 60, 70 years ago.
That's a good question. I think it's everybody has to, like you said, everybody has to find their own role. Some people are going to be doing things
Yeah.
in their garage, like Nikola Tesla, and some people want to be in the universities arguing about, holding court about social contract theory, right? And um,
Yeah.
I don't think that you can say one is better than the other, except for I think the the amount of suffering people are going to go through because of them eating toxic seed oils from birth is going to be so horrible. You think boomers are having a hard time with diseases. You wait and see how bad it's going
Yeah.
to be for younger generations. So when you think about
Yeah.
that, right? When you think about the calamity that is befalling all of us, and we have time to change, at some point you have to have that kind of emergency mindset come in and say, well, look, we've got to really put all hands on deck with solving these things that are causing people to have debilitating suffering diseases. Because I think I've made this point before, and I need to develop it more, but I think that, a lot of the animating envy and anger and resentments that motivate folks who are drawn to these leftist projects is sublimated from pain and suffering of seeing their fellow loved ones suffer from diseases. People don't like to make that connection.
Yeah.
Have you ever heard conservatives make that connection? I don't hear them ever say that, really. Um, but I think a lot
No,
of it
no,
has
no,
to
you're
do
right.
with I think a lot of it has to do because remember what Jesus talks about. The New Testament is filled with this idea that like diseases are spiritual warfare, you know,
Yeah.
and it's like an exorcism ministry when he's healing people, which makes you wonder,
Yeah.
like, okay, so there we go. The disease is a stronghold that creates relationships of dysfunction and anger and resentments, which then get swept up by whatever little Pied Piper wants to harness that energy into, put your fist up and go fight these people. See what I mean? And
Where
not just on
where
the
do you
physical
think
dynamic, seeing your grandma suffer, your parents suffer, you suffer, but also mental health problems because these seed oils cause a lot of the mental health problems and a lot of the other depression, bipolarity, and other things are related to these things. What we now know, this is the exciting thing. We now know that schizophrenia and bipolar, as Dr. Chris Palmer at Harvard, so there you go, there's someone in the institutions doing good work in some ways. Harvard,
Mhm.
Chris Palmer's been on my show several times in the past. We now know that these mental health diseases are largely metabolic. Metabolic. They're metabolic. So talk about a gut punch to the whole therapy, hegemony.
I- is he the one that uses the ketogenic diet?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. But he largely places, he can see people lose their voices in their head after a month or two of doing straight keto. So there's a debate though that the Ray Peat crowd would say that it's the seed oils, not the carbs, that's causing the things like schizophrenia and things to be so extreme. And so when he's reducing carbohydrates in his patients, he's reducing consumption of omega-6 because that's when you do keto, you're going to probably reduce some of your omega-6s by a lot because you're not going to eat as much junk food. There's a lot that's available right under our nose to solve problems like mental. Like, think about this for a second, Shane. We cannot gloss over this fact. If mental health disorders are largely driven by metabolic processes, then we've got to understand how to properly fuel our body.
Right.
And if a lot of this degenerate, vicious, and violent, aggressive hatred for other people who don't want to go along with radical deconstruction of gender and all these things, or whatever, if that's a lot of that is fueled by mental health problems, then fix the fuel.
Yeah.
And if you might say, well, what's going to motivate the leftists to want to eat healthy and good food? They may not be convinced that they have a mental problem driving their deranged ideology. So that might not be enough motivation to get them to change their diet. But maybe when they realize that diet problem is also driving diabetes, heart disease, cancer, Alzheimer's, and all these other terrible diseases, that might drive them to put some skin in the game and say, all right, I'll try something, I'll
Yeah.
try eating a more ancestrally appropriate diet. And I wouldn't
Yeah.
leave it just to that. I'm not totally ruling out, futuristic forms of meat either. I know that's pretty scary in conservative circles, but you know,
Yeah. Man, I'm not going to be touching that clone meat.
if you could
or,
put
or
it, if
not
you could,
clone, but the lab grown.
we have to see what's in the ingredients. Shane, it's been a great time talking to you. Thank you for your time.
Yeah. Thank you for having me, David.
We'll talk again soon. If you want to reach out to us, you can email me hello@aneighborschoice.com. That's hello@aneighborschoice.com.